All right, this is the big one. How do you mix around the color wheel to maintain brightness instead of going across the color wheel and creating dullness? It's all about making value shifts and driving around the color wheel. Yesterday I made a video about how do you mix a color if you don't know what that color is. And the color I was trying to mix has to do with this gold ball. And you can look at that video. But the question that came up after making that video was, how did I know what color to mix? How did I know what to do? Well, the first thing that I do is, I'm not a matchy-matchy painter. I'm not going to match to this exact photograph, but I do want to match for value. So looking at gold, gold is not yellow and gold is not brown. Gold is gold, right? So first I think to myself, all right, but it's basically yellow. But look at my yellows. These are the yellows on my palette. None of these yellows is going to work. They're all too light. They're all too light in value. So let's take a look at that for a second. All right, so look at that ball. Oop, there we go. You can see the ball there. And then I hold that up to my yellow values and see they disappear. So yellow isn't going to work, but yellow has to be part of the mix. So the first thing I did was I put some yellow, Hansa yellow, on the palette. And now I'm going to describe what I do in order to drive around the color wheel to find a color if I don't know what it is. So I started with yellow, and then I added some burnt quinacridone sienna to that, which is a slightly orange neutral. That's not on my color wheel. I don't have any neutrals on my color wheel. That resulted in something that was very similar to an orange. And I compared that, and I still wasn't at the value that I needed to get to. So I was asked the question. The question specifically was, Joe, if you knew you needed to go darker, you needed a darker color in order to create form, why didn't you go to blues or violets? And the reason I didn't go to blues or violets is I'm already here. I'm already in orange. And if I go into blues or violets, that's going to be the opposite on the color wheel. The opposite on the color wheel is going to give me gray or brown. And I already decided that this yellow ball or gold ball, it's not yellow and it's not brown. So I can't mix a neutral. The other thing is that I didn't want it to dull down. I wanted these forms to look bright. And the minute you go across the color wheel, you'll definitely get the value shift that you want. I'll get something darker, but it's also going to be duller. And I didn't want that. So now I have to drive around the color wheel. Well, what do I do? Well, if I go this way, I'm going to end up with oranger looking colors that aren't dark enough until I finally get to violet, and then it's going to do that neutralizing thing. I'm going to end up in brown and then ultimately in gray or black. So I have to go the other way. I'm here, and so I start going this way. And the first thing that I come to is a green. Now, I have two greens on my palette. One's Viridian. Viridian has a lot of blue in it, which again is going to have the opposite. It's going to have that graying down effect. So I stopped here and I said, okay, I've got I think it's called what is that green? It's just a medium green. So I went here, and you can see these are relatively closer on the color wheel to each other. I didn't have to drive very far to get to this green. The other thing about this green is, yes, it has some blue in it, but not as much as blue itself and not as much as my Viridian. The other thing is the green has a lot of yellow in it, and I already have incorporated yellow into my mix. That's what I did when I created this orange. So the best choice, if I want to go darker, I want to go a little darker. I don't want maybe a half a step, maybe a whole step. I'm not sure yet because it's the first thing I'm doing in the painting, and I'll adjust things as I go along. But I don't want to drive all the way, look around the color wheel. All of these choices would have been poor choices. These choices would have left me with an oranger or redder looking ball. These ones would have left me with a brown ball. These ones would have left me with a black or gray ball. So my only other choice was to go this way and to get to a green with a lot of yellow in it. And once I did that, I ended up with a color that was very similar to this. This is my second pass at it, But in other words, I went in and darkened it. This wasn't the first color that I chose. I sort of snuck up on it a little bit. But you can see from that almost all the colors that I derived to create this ball were based on a recipe of yellow, a burnt sienna, or in my case, quinacridone sienna, which got me to orange, and then I went over to green. So my reason for choosing green was because it would not dull down, and I already had incorporated yellow in the mix. I wasn't going to completely neutralize the color. Now, I know that sounds incredibly complicated, but in general, if you want to retain brightness, go around the color wheel, and if you want to neutralize, then go across the color wheel. So here's another example of that. This is a chart I've had for a long time. If you look here, these sides are exactly the same. The yellow here and the orange here are exactly the same, yellow and orange. But in this case, in order to maintain brightness, you see how bright that is? I added some red, probably some alizarin red to this color to get to that one. So I've gone around the color wheel to maintain brightness. Now, if I go across the color wheel, I'll get the value change I want, which is what I did here. So I went around the color wheel and I added some violet, and I get the color change I want. These are almost exactly the same in value. In other words, in terms of how dark or light they are, it's almost exactly the same. It's very hard to see. Yeah, impossible to see. But if I squint with my eyes, I can see that they are darker in value. These front planes are darker in value than the side plane or the top plane. But the way I went about it was completely different. On this one, I went across the color wheel. I went from yellow over to violet. And here, I went from yellow and added an alizarin crimson to it. And look at the difference in brightness in terms of that front plane. See how much brighter this one is than this one? So that is in essence what I was doing with that gold ball. I'm trying to do the same thing. I want to have that value shift. I definitely want that. And there are times when you have to go across the color wheel. But to maintain brightness, I don't want to do that. So that's the same thing that happens here. It happens in the middle one too, but let me explain this one. These sides are exactly the same. Cerulean blue, ultramarine blue, cerulean blue, ultramarine blue. But the difference is that on the dull one, I added some orange, and see how much duller that plane is in the front. And on this one, what I did was I added, trying to remember, I would have gone around the color wheel and added some, probably again, alizarin crimson. And see the difference? So if I want to maintain brightness, it's great in theory to think about the color wheel and to know that you can, where did my color wheel go? Oh yeah. It's great in theory to know about the color wheel and to know that you can get a value shift, a really dramatic shift when you go across the color wheel, but you're going to sacrifice brightness in the process. And the other thing you're going to do is you get involved in temperature. So sometimes when I'm talking about brightness, I'm also talking about temperature. I knew that I wanted the overall ball, this overall gold ball, to be warm. And I can maintain warmth as long as I don't put any blue or violet in here. Do everything I can to possibly change the value without going across the color wheel. So that's the theory behind yesterday's video and why I did what I did. I mix around the color wheel for brightness, and I mix across the color wheel when I want to neutralize. And that's super important too, because there are times you want to neutralize and get like a gray, or I mix all my grays anyway. So here's a more studied, I'm not done with this yet, I'll finish this today, but you can see what I'm doing here is the same thing. That is what I did with this ball. In order to maintain gold, I didn't go across the color wheel, I went around and added green. And the other reason that it made sense to add green was there was a green ball nearby, and so I knew that this form was probably picking up some of the color from this form as well. So sometimes you can be just informed by proximity and making your best guess. But more than anything, it has to do with a lot of experience of practicing mixing color over a long period of time, and you just kind of know. It's more like a feeling that you know. And the reason that you know is because By that time, you probably crossed the color wheel so many times. I mean, how many times did I paint a painting and think, wow, that looks terrific? You know, and then I come back like a day later and everything was extremely dulled down. And that was something I discussed in the video yesterday. I could have gone into yellow ochre, for example, right from the tube. But yellow ochre is extremely dull. I mean, it looks pretty dull once you take it out of the tube. It's a neutral. But, you know, the next day, it is even duller. So, you know, maybe you handle yellow ochre extremely well. I don't. You know, almost every time I bring it into play, it ends up looking dull to me. And I want my paintings to have brightness. I want them to have saturation. I want them to have neutrals as well. And I want to control the value range. You know, there are times when I want the value range to be not as you know, not the whole spectrum. Like, for example, in this painting, you know, if you look at that ball probably is only value 1 through, I'm going to say 4, maybe 1 through 4. It just doesn't get very dark. There's definitely some darkness happening, yeah, in this form. But I'll bet you this one is not very much different, probably 1 through 5. So I want to control the value range and know that I'm in control of it. And it makes sense, you know, if you're creating a lighter form, to stay in a higher key, to stay in a higher value range. And if you're going to create darker forms, I mean, pretty obviously this is the darkest form, then you're going to go into a darker value range. So I hope that makes sense. I'll say it again, mix around the color wheel for brightness, mix across the color wheel for your neutrals, or if you can't find another way to drive around the color wheel to maintain brightness. Sometimes it's the only thing, you know, the only tool you have at hand, so you have to do it. So I hope that makes sense. Remember to keep the whites of your paper white, your paints wet, master value, mix for color, and I'll see you next time. Okay, bye-bye.